A test paper was slammed onto the desk. "Ryan, you cheated, didn't you?" The classroom fell silent. A few students smirked, eager to watch the usual scene, Ryan being humiliated by Mr. Thompson in front of everyone. Ryan picked up the test. 100 points. He wasn't surprised, but the cold glare from Mr. Thompson said it all. He didn't believe him. "A student like you could never do this." The accusation wasn't about the test. It was about who he was. Now back to Ryan. A week ago, Ryan was almost invisible in the eyes of everyone. He was the boy who sat in the back corner of the classroom, always with his head down, avoiding attention. Teachers rarely paid attention to him, and students often forgot he was there. But for some reason, Mr. Thompson seemed to take a particular interest in making Ryan's life difficult. It started with small things, calling his name when he knew Ryan wouldn't respond, criticizing his work for trivial mistakes, and even mocking his quiet nature in front of the class. Ryan endured all of this without complaint, but the cold exterior he had built began to crack. One day during math class, Mr. Thompson caught Ryan quietly writing in his notebook. "Ryan," he barked, "what's so interesting?" Ryan hesitated for a moment but finally walked to the front with his notebook. The class giggled as Mr. Thompson snatched the notebook from his hands. "What's this?" Mr. Thompson flipped through the pages, his sneer slowly turning to confusion. The notebook was filled with complex equations and diagrams far beyond the level of the class. "Where did you copy this from?" "I didn't copy it," Ryan responded calmly. "I just worked out some problems." Mr. Thompson laughed loudly. "Don't lie, no middle schooler can do this. Did your parents do it for you?" Ryan's face turned red with embarrassment. "No, sir. I solved it myself." That moment marked the beginning of a week of relentless testing. Mr. Thompson seemed determined to expose Ryan as a fraud. He gave him difficult problems, called him to the board every day, and sneered whenever Ryan succeeded. The breaking point came with a midterm test. Mr. Thompson deliberately included a trick question, confident Ryan would fail. But when Ryan completed the first part and handed it in, Mr. Thompson said dismissively, "Let's see what our little genius can do." He graded the paper on the spot, his expression growing darker each time Ryan answered correctly. "No way," Mr. Thompson muttered. "You cheated." The class exhaled collectively. Ryan, now no longer silent, spoke up louder than ever. "I didn't cheat," he said firmly. "Why do you hate me so much?" The room fell silent. Mr. Thompson was speechless, caught by the raw fury in his own voice. "Enough," he shouted. "Stay after class." Ryan didn't argue. He sat down, his face unreadable, but something had shifted in him. The quiet boy was no longer willing to stay silent. The next day, Ryan entered the classroom with a look of determination. Mr. Thompson wasted no time, immediately challenging him in front of the class. "Since you're so smart, why don't you solve this one?" he sneered, pointing to a new equation on the board. And that was the moment everything fell apart for Mr. Thompson. In the principal's office, the door slammed shut. The principal's voice rang out, sharp and unmistakable. Meanwhile, Ryan returned to his seat, ignoring the stares of his classmates, silent as if nothing had happened. The school would never be the same again. Ryan may have won this battle, but the war was far from over. Mr. Thompson wasn't the type of person to let a student surpass him without seeking revenge. Ryan understood that. He didn't know what Mr. Thompson would do to regain his pride. The question was not whether there would be a confrontation, but when. The aftermath of that day came like a quiet storm. Ryan's classmates whispered his name with admiration, some in awe, others with envy. For the first time in his life, Ryan became the center of attention, but he hated it. He just wanted to quietly go back to his corner, where no one bothered him. The next day, Mr. Thompson returned to class with a forced smile and a sharp tone that everyone recognized. He started the lesson as if nothing had happened, but his eyes often flickered toward Ryan, who kept his gaze down and focused on his work. However, the silence didn't last long. "Ryan," Mr. Thompson suddenly called, his tone soft but laden with hidden meaning. "Stay after class. I want to discuss your future in this subject." The class exchanged knowing glances. Ryan simply nodded, his face expressionless. When the bell rang, Ryan didn't hurry to leave. Mr. Thompson closed the door behind the last student, leaning against it with his arms crossed. "You're famous now, aren't you?" Mr. Thompson began pacing. "Everyone's talking about how you, the quiet kid, made a fool of me in front of the class. Is that what you wanted?" "No, sir," Ryan answered calmly. "Then what?" Mr. Thompson pressed. "Did you want to humiliate me, defeat me in front of the class?" Ryan shook his head. "I wasn't trying to do anything. You kept calling on me, I just answered." Mr. Thompson's smile twisted into a grimace. "You think you're smarter than me, don't you?" Ryan hesitated, meeting his gaze. "I just think I'm good at math," he answered simply. The response only fueled Mr. Thompson's anger further. "Let's see how good you really are," he said, pulling a thick textbook from his desk. He flipped through the pages rapidly before throwing it down in front of Ryan. "Solve the hardest problem in there. No calculator, no notes. Right now." Ryan glanced at the book. The problem inside was from a college-level textbook, something no high school student would be able to understand. But instead of backing down, Ryan picked up his pen and started working. His brow furrowed in intense concentration as the calculations appeared on the page. Mr. Thompson leaned forward, watching his every move, waiting for Ryan to stumble, to falter, to admit defeat. But Ryan didn't do that. After 15 minutes of silence, Ryan pushed the paper across the desk. "Done," he said. Mr. Thompson snatched up the paper, his eyes scanning it quickly, then his face turned pale as he realized the answer was correct. "How did you know all this?" Mr. Thompson demanded. "This isn't normal." Ryan hesitated, not wanting to explain the nights he'd spent studying math books, the passion he had for solving puzzles, or how numbers were the only things that made everything feel meaningful. Instead, he simply shrugged. "I just like math." "Get out," Mr. Thompson barked, throwing the paper aside. "And don't think this is over." Ryan left the classroom, feeling a mix of relief and unease. He knew Mr. Thompson wouldn't let it go easily, but he couldn't understand why the teacher hated him so much. At lunch, Ryan sat alone as usual. He opened his book, trying to lose himself in it, but the noise around him made it hard to concentrate. "Hey, math genius," a voice called. Ryan looked up to see James, one of the troublemakers, grinning at him. "I hear you made Thompson look like an idiot." Ryan stayed silent, hoping James would get bored and leave. "Come on, don't be shy." James plopped down in the seat across from him. "That was amazing. You should do it again." "It's not a competition," Ryan muttered, eyes back on his book. "Seems like a competition to me," James said, bursting into laughter. "Thompson's gonna want revenge, you know. You better watch out." Ryan glanced at him, surprised by the warning. James wasn't the type to care about anyone but himself. "Why do you care?" Ryan asked. "I don't care," James admitted, "but I don't want to see you fail. That would mess up the whole show." Ryan sighed and closed his book. "I don't want to fight him." "Could be," James said, standing up. "Good luck, genius. You'll need it." The rest of the week passed relatively quietly, or at least it appeared. So, Mr. Thompson no longer publicly criticized Ryan, though his eyes still lingered on him whenever he passed by. Ryan tried to ignore it, focusing on his work and keeping his head down. But one morning he arrived at school and found a note in his locker. The note was typed, no name or signature, but the message was clear: "You're not as smart as you think. Stop showing off or you'll regret it." Ryan felt his stomach tighten. He looked around the hallway, but no one seemed to be paying attention to him. He folded the note and stuffed it in his pocket, his mind spinning. Sent this? Mr. Thompson? Some other student? Was it a prank, or was someone actually trying to scare him? When Ryan walked into his math class, he felt the tension in the air. He sat down, glancing at Mr. Thompson, who was writing on the board. The teacher's expression was calm, almost too calm, and Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. And then it did. "Class, today I have a special assignment for you," Mr. Thompson said, turning to face the students. "A group project." Class groaned, and Ryan's heart sank. He hated group work because it always meant working with people who didn't understand him or, worse, made fun of him. You'll be paired randomly, Mr. Thompson continued, holding up a list. And your task is to solve an advanced set of problems together. This project will count for a large portion of your grade, so I suggest you take it seriously. He began reading off the pairs, and Ryan's sense of dread grew with each name. Finally, when he read Ryan's name, his mouth curled into a smirk. Ryan, you'll be working with James. Ryan's stomach twisted. James, the troublemaker, the one who thrived in chaos, was the last person he wanted to work with. James laughed, sliding his chair next to Ryan. This should be fun, James said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Ryan stayed silent, his mind racing. He didn't know if this was a punishment, a coincidence, or part of a bigger plan, but one thing was certain, Mr. Thompson wasn't done with him yet. Ryan looked down at the assignment while James leaned back in his chair, flashing a mischievous grin. Mr. Thompson stood there, watching them like a hawk. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, and Ryan knew this was just the beginning of whatever game the teacher was playing. Ryan stared at the problem, his mind spinning. The questions were convoluted, far beyond what anyone in the class could solve. It was clear this wasn't a test of knowledge, but a trap. So, what are you going to do? James asked, leaning back in his chair with a mocking grin. Solve it all while I just sit here and look pretty? Ryan didn't respond immediately. He knew James wouldn't help him, and worse, he had a feeling James would deliberately make things harder. But he didn't want Mr. Thompson to see him struggling. You go first, Ryan murmured. If you don't want to help, then don't get in my way. James exhaled loudly, pretending to be surprised. Oh, how commanding. Fine, suit yourself, James said, leaning back, resting his chin on his hand, eyes fixed on Ryan. But don't expect me to save you when Thompson rips your paper apart. Ryan ignored him, focusing back on the first problem. The numbers danced on the page, forming patterns in his mind. He wrote out equations, the pencil moving smoothly and confidently. When he finished, James was staring at him, wide-eyed, eyebrows raised. You really solved this? James asked, genuinely impressed. Yeah, Ryan replied, not looking up. You want to check my work or just sit there? James let out a loud laugh, raising his hand in mock surrender. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But whatever, I'm good. Keep going, Einstein. Ryan sighed and moved on to the next problem. The scratch of his pencil on paper was the only sound in the otherwise noisy room, the murmur of other groups' conversations filling the space. Mr. Thompson walked up and down the rows, occasionally pausing, glancing over Ryan and James' desks. Every time the teacher's shadow fell on their table, Ryan's heart skipped a beat. Everything okay, you two? Mr. Thompson asked, his voice carrying a hint of concern. Yeah, sir, Ryan replied, not looking up. Good, Mr. Thompson said, his eyes lingering on the paper in front of Ryan. Remember, this is a group project. You both need to contribute. Ryan clenched his jaw but said nothing. James, contrary to expectations, spoke up. Don't worry, sir, I'm contributing a lot. Moral support, you know. Plus, chuckled, and Mr. Thompson's lips pressed into a thin line. Just make sure you both turn in something worthy of a grade, he said, then continued his rounds. Ryan waited until the teacher had walked away before glaring at James. Could you at least pretend to care a little? Relax, James raised his hand defensively. You're doing fine, no need to make it harder. Ryan shook his head and returned to the problem at hand. He was working through it when he noticed something strange. The fourth question didn't make sense. The numbers didn't match, and the instructions were vague. He continued to tap his pencil on the desk, thinking it over. Why stop? James asked, leaning over to look at the paper. This question is wrong, Ryan muttered. No way, James scoffed. Thompson's too meticulous to make a mistake. Ryan didn't reply, focusing intently on the problem again. He recalculated in his head. The more he looked, the more certain he became. The question wasn't just difficult, it was unsolvable. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Ryan had finished almost everything except the erroneous question. James stretched and yawned, clearly bored. Done. Let me know the results, Einstein. Ryan packed up his things, but his mind was still fixated on the flawed question. He knew he couldn't turn in his paper like this, because Mr. Thompson would use the unanswered question as a reason to criticize him. But if he pointed out the mistake, things could get even worse. When he got home, Ryan spread the paper across his desk. He spent hours trying to find a solution, but no matter what he tried, the numbers refused to cooperate. Frustrated, he grabbed a new sheet of paper and wrote a detailed explanation of why the question was wrong, complete with diagrams and examples. If Mr. Thompson wanted to play games, Ryan was going to show him that he wasn't someone who gave up easily. The next day, Ryan turned in his paper with a mix of anxiety and defiance. He didn't look at Mr. Thompson when he placed the paper on the teacher's desk, but he could feel the teacher's gaze locked on him. "Good luck," James said with a half smile as they left class. "I think you're going to need it." Ryan barely slept that night. His mind kept running through worst-case scenarios. Would Mr. Thompson accuse him of cheating again? Or worse, would he mark the whole paper as wrong just to punish him? Every possibility played out in his head, and none of them looked good. The next morning, when Ryan walked into math class, the tension in the room was palpable. Mr. Thompson stood at the front, a stack of papers in hand, his face unreadable, but his eyes immediately locked onto Ryan. "Sit down," his voice was cold. The class quickly settled, sensing something was about to happen. Mr. Thompson began handing back the papers, his face expressionless as he moved past each desk. When he reached Ryan, he stopped, holding the paper just out of reach. "Well, Ryan," Mr. Thompson's voice lingered with a hint of mockery. "Let's see what your group managed to do." Ryan took the paper, his hand trembling slightly. His heart sank as he saw the glaring red B at the top of the page. A note in the margin: Question 4 was not solved correctly. Ryan's mind raced. "But it's wrong." The words slipped out before he could stop them. "The question doesn't even make sense." The room fell silent. Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow. "What did you just say?" "The question," Ryan repeated, his voice steadier this time. "It can't be solved. I explained that in the notes." Mr. Thompson's gaze narrowed. "Are you saying I made a mistake?" The room seemed to freeze. Ryan knew he was walking a fine line, but he couldn't back down. "Yes," he said, his voice firm. "I think so." Mr. Thompson's face darkened. His fingers gripped the edge of the desk until they turned white. "Stay after class," he said, his voice ice cold. The bell rang immediately after. The class rushed out, leaving Ryan alone. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for what was to come. Mr. Thompson shut the door behind him and turned to face Ryan. His face was devoid of expression. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Mr. Thompson's voice was low, dangerous. Ryan didn't respond. He stood still, his heart pounding in his chest. "Listen here, kid," Mr. Thompson took a step closer. "You might be good at math, but in the real world, people like you don't get far if they keep making enemies." Ryan clenched his fists. The fear slowly gave way to anger. "I'm not trying to make enemies," he said quietly. "I just want to be treated fairly." Mr. Thompson let out a harsh laugh, a cold, mocking sound. "Fairness." His voice dripped with disdain. "There's no such thing as fairness in life, kid. The sooner you realize that, the better off you'll be." Ryan looked him straight in the eye. He didn't know what Mr. Thompson was planning to do, but the resentment in his eyes was so heavy it felt almost suffocating. Then, suddenly, Mr. Thompson grabbed the test paper and ripped it right in front of Ryan. "Let's see how you prove your point now," he said, a mocking smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. He'd just destroyed the only evidence of the faulty question. Ryan stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the torn pieces of paper falling onto the desk. Mr. Thompson's smile deepened as he bent down, staring at him. "What's wrong?" His voice was stretched, taunting. "Got nothing to say now?" Ryan's mind was spinning. He felt cornered, but he wasn't going to let panic consume him. Slowly, he straightened up, his gaze unwavering. "I don't need the paper to prove it," he said calmly. "I've got everything written in my notebook." For a brief moment, Mr. Thompson's smile faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. "Oh really? How convenient." Ryan nodded. If you want, you can check it. Mr. Thompson's eyes hardened. That's enough, he spat. Get out of my class. Now. Ryan hesitated. Now. His voice echoed through the empty room. Ryan grabbed his bag and left the classroom, his mind spinning as he walked down the hallway. This wasn't over, he knew that for sure. Mr. Thompson was trying to intimidate him, but this time, Ryan wouldn't let him win. That evening, Ryan sat at his desk, flipping through his notebook. He carefully wrote out the explanation of the error in the question, adding more detail and double-checking every calculation. He wanted to make sure there were no mistakes. Satisfied, he scanned the handwritten pages with his dad's old printer and emailed them to the principal, attaching the document along with a brief message. Subject: Issue with grading on recent assignment. Dear Principal Carter, I'm writing to report an issue with a question in our recent assignment for Mr. Thompson's class. One of the questions was unsolvable due to an error in the problem setup. I explained this in my notes, but my grade was still penalized. I've attached my work for your review. Thank you for your time. Sincerely, Ryan Harper. Ryan hit send, then closed his laptop. He didn't know what would happen next, but at least he'd taken action. The next morning, Ryan entered school with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. He kept his head down, avoiding everyone's gaze as he made his way to math class. As soon as he entered the room, the tension in the air was palpable. Mr. Thompson was standing at the teacher's desk, his face rigid with anger. Ryan sat down, trying to ignore the piercing stare of Mr. Thompson. The lesson went on as usual, but he couldn't focus. His mind was only on the clock, counting down the minutes until class was over. Finally, the bell rang. As the students began packing up, Mr. Thompson's voice cut through the noise. Ryan, stay behind. Ryan's heart sank. He nodded, remaining seated as the classroom emptied. Mr. Thompson closed the door behind him and turned to face Ryan. You think I don't know what you've done? His voice was sharp. Ryan blinked, confused. What do you mean? Don't play innocent with me, Mr. Thompson sneered. You went and tattled to the principal, didn't you? Trying to slander me? Ryan's heart raced. He never expected the principal to respond so quickly. I didn't mean to embarrass you, sir, he said softly. I just wanted my grade to reflect my work. Mr. Thompson let out a dry laugh. Your work? He scoffed. You're just a kid, Ryan. You don't understand how the world works. People like you should know your place. Ryan clenched his jaw. People like me? That's right, Thompson sneered. You little punks, always trying to show off, thinking you can outsmart the teachers. He stepped closer, lowering his voice in a menacing tone. Let me give you some advice. Nobody likes a pompous fool. A surge of anger flared within Ryan, but he held his ground. I'm not trying to show off, he replied, his voice steady. I just want to learn. Then maybe you should learn how to keep your head down, Thompson said coldly. Because if you keep this up, you're going to have a lot of trouble. Ryan said nothing. He stood up, slinging his bag over his shoulder. Anything else, sir? He asked. Mr. Thompson's expression darkened. Get out of my classroom. By lunchtime, the whole school knew about it. Somehow, news of Ryan's email had spread to everyone. As he sat alone in the cafeteria, he could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. Whispers followed him. Wherever he went. Did you hear? Ryan reported Mr. Thompson. Yeah, I heard he's trying to get him fired. No way. Thompson's a pain, but he's not going anywhere. Ryan tried to ignore it, but he couldn't. He had no appetite. His chest felt tight, as if someone had a hand around his ribs. For as long as he could remember, he'd been invisible. But now he was the center of attention, and not in a good way. James suddenly appeared, setting his tray down across from Ryan with a grin. So, you went to the principal, huh? He chuckled, his eyes bright with amusement. Ryan glared at him. I didn't do it to stir up trouble. Sounds like you're doing exactly that, James said, taking a bite of his sandwich. You know Thompson's going to make your life miserable from now on, right? I can handle it, Ryan muttered. Sure you can. James raised an eyebrow, a half-smile playing on his lips. Ryan let out a short laugh, but James's tone remained mocking. Just so you know, if he starts playing dirty, don't expect me to step in." Ryan didn't bother responding. He simply stood up, grabbed his tray, and walked away, his face burning with anger. Later that afternoon, Ryan was called to the principal's office. As he walked down the hallway, anxiety bubbled up inside him. His mind raced with all the possible reasons for the summons. When he stepped into the office, Principal Carter greeted him with a warm smile. "Take a seat, Ryan." Ryan slowly lowered himself into the chair, gripping his bag tightly. "Am I in trouble?" he asked cautiously. "Not at all," Principal Carter replied. "I reviewed your work and I agree with your assessment. The question in the assignment was flawed, and your explanation was very thorough." Ryan felt a wave of relief wash over him. "So that means, I've asked Mr. Thompson to adjust your grade," Principal Carter continued, her expression growing more serious. "I've also suggested he be more careful when preparing assignments in the future." The relief was short-lived. Principal Carter's face grew more solemn. "But Ryan, I need to remind you of something," she said slowly, her tone laced with meaning. "Mr. Thompson is an experienced teacher, and this situation has caused some difficulties. Always maintain respect, even if you disagree with him." Ryan nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that her words were more of a warning than advice. Back in class, Ryan couldn't shake the sensation that everyone was watching him. The relief of his grade being corrected was overshadowed by one undeniable truth: Mr. Thompson wasn't going to let this go. And Ryan was right. As soon as he sat down, he noticed a folded piece of paper tucked between the pages of his book. He opened it, his heart sinking as he read the hastily scrawled, angry words. "You'll regret this." A chill ran through Ryan's veins. He scanned the room, searching for anyone who might have slipped the note into his book. But everyone was busy taking notes, no one paying him any attention. On the board, Mr. Thompson continued writing equations as though nothing had happened. But Ryan knew better. This was far from over. He crumpled the note in his hand, his heart pounding. He couldn't let this slide. After class, Ryan decided to stay behind. He waited until the last student had left before walking to the teacher's desk. His hand shook slightly as he placed the note on the desk. "Mr. Thompson, can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked. Thompson looked up, his eyes cold. "Make it quick." Ryan swallowed hard and pointed to the note. "I found this in my book." Thompson glanced at the writing before curling his lips into a small, mocking smile. "Is that so?" "I think," Ryan struggled to keep his voice steady. "I think someone's trying to threaten me." Thompson leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Do you have any proof?" Ryan bit his lip and shook his head. "Then perhaps you should focus on your studies rather than making baseless accusations." The teacher grabbed the paper, crumpled it, and tossed it into the trash. "This is not my problem." Ryan's chest tightened with fury. "But you can leave now, Ryan." The teacher's voice was cold as ice. "Unless you want to waste more of my time." Ryan clenched his fists, but then took a deep breath and turned to walk away. He knew arguing with Mr. Thompson right now would get him nowhere. But he hadn't expected the teacher to dismiss everything so easily. That night, Ryan sat at his desk, staring at the blank page in front of him. He wanted to figure out how to confront Mr. Thompson, to prove that he was the one behind the threatening note. But every idea seemed too risky. If he pushed things too far, the retaliation could be worse. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. His mom peeked in, smiling softly. "Dinner's ready." Ryan nodded, trying to force a smile. "I'll be down in a minute." She hesitated, her gaze softening. "You've been so quiet lately. Is everything okay at school?" Ryan hesitated. He wanted to tell his mom about Mr. Thompson, about the threatening note, about everything. But a part of him feared she wouldn't understand. Or worse, she might intervene and make everything more complicated. "Yeah," he said finally. "It's just a lot of homework." His mom nodded. "All right, but if anything's wrong, you know I'm always here, right?" "Yeah," Ryan replied softly. "Thanks, Mom." The next day, Ryan walked into math class, determined to stay quiet and avoid causing any more trouble. But as soon as he sat down, something felt off. His notebook was gone. He tore apart his bag, checked under his desk, even bent down to look around the floor of the classroom, but it was useless. Looking for this? A voice came from behind. Ryan turned around to see James holding his notebook, a triumphant smirk on his face. "I'm just borrowing it for a bit," James said, waving the notebook. "Wanna see the nerdy stuff you've written in here? Give it back." Ryan's voice was low but firm. James laughed, flipping through the pages quickly. "It's all just numbers and formulas. Don't you ever write anything normal?" "I'm serious, James." Ryan clenched his fists. "Give it back. Now." Before James could respond, the classroom door opened. Mr. Thompson walked in. "What's going on here?" His voice was authoritative. James quickly shoved the notebook into Ryan's hands, shrugging. "Nothing, sir. Just joking around." Ryan sat down, shoving the notebook into his bag, his hands still trembling slightly. He could feel Mr. Thompson's gaze drilling into him, but he didn't look up. The lesson passed in an unusually tense silence. Mr. Thompson kept calling on Ryan to answer, watching him with a cold, piercing stare as if he were waiting for a mistake, a sign of weakness. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Ryan quickly gathered his things, but Mr. Thompson was already standing by the teacher's desk, waiting. "Ryan." His voice was softer than usual. "I need to talk to you for a moment." A wave of nausea rose in Ryan's stomach, but he nodded and walked over. Mr. Thompson crossed his arms, leaning against the desk. "You've been causing quite a stir lately." "I haven't done anything wrong," Ryan replied calmly. Mr. Thompson's smile was cold. "That's still up for debate. But let me give you some advice. Nobody likes a troublemaker. If you keep this up, you'll only make things harder for yourself." A surge of defiance rose within Ryan. "I just want to be treated fairly." For a brief moment, the smile vanished from Mr. Thompson's face. His eyes became inscrutable. Then he leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Fairness, huh? Ryan, there's no such thing. The sooner you understand that, the less you'll suffer." That night, Ryan decided he couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his phone, switched on the voice recorder, and spoke into the silence of his room, slow and clear. He recounted everything: the threatening note, the missing notebook, Mr. Thompson's warnings. He wasn't sure what he would do with the recording, but at least he would have evidence. The next morning, Ryan arrived at school early. He walked into the library, sat down at one of the computers, and began typing an email. To the school board. He laid out the entire situation and attached the recording. He hesitated for a moment, then clicked send. When he walked into math class, a strange mix of fear and relief washed over him. He knew he had taken a risk, but at least he wasn't going to let Mr. Thompson bully him anymore. Ryan sat down, quietly observing. Mr. Thompson stood at the front of the room, holding his phone, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. It was clear, he had read the email. Ryan clenched his fists beneath the desk. The real battle was just beginning. Mr. Thompson's expression flickered with confusion, anger, and panic. His hand shook slightly as he placed the phone on the desk, his gaze scanning the room until it landed on Ryan. For a brief moment, his mask slipped, revealing the fury boiling beneath the surface. Ryan felt his heart race, but he kept his face composed. He wasn't going to back down. "Class, silence." Mr. Thompson's voice rang out louder than usual. The already tense atmosphere in the room grew heavier. He began the lesson, but it was clear something was off. His voice trembled slightly, his words stumbled, and his gaze was unfocused. He was distracted. Ryan knew exactly why. An email had reached him, and it was only a matter of time before the consequences would unfold. After the bell, Ryan quickly packed up his things, eager to leave before Mr. Thompson could stop him. But just as he reached the door, the teacher's voice rang out, firm and commanding. "Ryan, stay for a moment." Ryan turned around, keeping his expression neutral. The classroom was empty now, just the two of them remaining. The air was thick with tension. Mr. Thompson gestured for Ryan to approach the teacher's desk. Ryan hesitated for a moment but eventually walked over, gripping his backpack strap like it was his only lifeline. "Sit down," The teacher's voice was sharp. Ryan sat down, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what was coming, but he was ready to face it. "What are you trying to accomplish?" Mr. Thompson leaned forward, his voice low and cutting. Ryan didn't flinch. "I just want to be treated fairly." Mr. Thompson sneered, but there was no warmth in his smile. "Fairly?" He placed his hands on the desk, emphasizing each word. "You think sending emails to the principal, the school board, and whoever else you've involved will bring you fairness?" Ryan didn't blink. "I also don't think bullying is fair." For a brief moment, Mr. Thompson's expression darkened. He looked like he was about to explode, but then he quickly regained his composure, a cold smile creeping across his face. "You've made a big mistake, Ryan." Ryan clenched his fists, fear gnawing at his stomach, but his voice remained steady. "I don't think so." Mr. Thompson's smile widened, but his eyes were hollow. "Let me tell you how this is going to end. You make a fuss, people will pay attention for a while. But eventually, they'll forget. And me? I'll still be here. What about you?" He tilted his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll be forgotten." Ryan stood up, his heart racing, but his gaze unwavering. "We'll see." He turned and walked out of the classroom, his breath quick but his resolve stronger than ever. Mr. Thompson was not untouchable. And Ryan would prove that. At lunch that day, Ryan sat alone in the library, earbuds in, quietly listening to the recording from the night before. He was thinking, should he send it to the principal, or keep it as leverage? Suddenly, a light tap on his shoulder startled him. Ryan turned to find James, his usual tormentor, standing there with an unusually serious expression. Ryan narrowed his eyes. "What do you want?" James pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, arms crossed. "Relax. I'm not here to pick a fight." "Then what are you here for?" James was silent for a moment, as if weighing whether to speak. Then he exhaled sharply. "I heard you're going after Thompson." Ryan nodded. "He's not getting away with this." James scratched his head, looking awkward. "Things, you should be careful. Thompson has connections. My brother had him a few years ago, got into it with Thompson over something small. Guess who got disciplined for a month, while Thompson came out unscathed?" Ryan furrowed his brow. "That won't happen this time." James leaned back in his chair, arms still crossed. "Maybe. But you should know, Thompson doesn't play fair. You're smart, but he's got years of experience covering his tracks." Ryan studied James, trying to figure out if this was a genuine warning or just another game. "Why do you care?" Ryan finally asked. James shrugged. "I don't. But it'd suck if you put all this effort into fighting just to get crushed." Ryan sighed. "Thanks for the heads up. But I'm not backing down." James nodded, a fleeting smile crossing his face. "Suit yourself, Einstein. Just don't say I didn't warn you." He stood up, shoved his hands into his pockets, and left the library, leaving Ryan behind, still staring at the screen. He wasn't scared. He wouldn't stop. That evening, Ryan received an email from Principal Carter, requesting a meeting the next morning. The message was polite but curt, making it impossible to tell whether it was good or bad news. He spent the entire night preparing, reviewing his notes and listening to the recording once more. The next morning, Ryan walked into the principal's office with his head held high. Principal Carter nodded in greeting and gestured for him to sit down. To his surprise, Mr. Thompson was already there, sitting rigidly with his arms crossed, an expression of both tension and frustration on his face. "Ryan," Principal Carter began, "I've reviewed your email and the documents you've provided. I've also spoken with Mr. Thompson about your concerns." Ryan glanced at Mr. Thompson, but the teacher avoided his gaze. "After careful consideration," Principal Carter continued, "I have decided to report this matter to the district office. They will conduct an independent investigation to ensure that everything is handled properly." Ryan's heart raced. He hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly, but the sense that someone was truly listening to him brought a sense of relief. Mr. Thompson's voice suddenly cut through the tense silence, sharp as a knife. "With all due respect, Principal Carter, I believe this is unnecessary. This is just a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by a student who doesn't fully understand the pressures of teaching. Ryan clenched his fists. This is not a misunderstanding, he said, his voice calm yet firm. You've been bullying me since day one. Enough! Principal Carter interrupted, her cold gaze sweeping across both of them. She turned to Mr. Thompson. I understand your concerns, but this is no longer within my discretion. The district office will make the final decision. The air in the room felt suffocating. Ryan sensed a moment of victory, but he knew the battle wasn't over. Not yet. As he left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Thompson was plotting something. The man had been backed into a corner, but someone like Thompson wouldn't accept defeat easily. On his way back to class, Ryan passed the teacher's lounge. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, he heard Mr. Thompson's low voice, filled with anger. If that kid thinks he's won, he has no idea what's coming. Ryan froze, his heart pounding. The threat was clear. He knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. Everything blurred together in a haze of whispers and sidelong glances. By the time the bell rang, signaling the end of school, Ryan felt as though he'd just run a marathon. As he stuffed his books into his backpack, James appeared beside him, leaning against the desk. Hey, Einstein, James squinted. I heard you had a meeting with the principal. How'd it go? Ryan hesitated, weighing whether to tell the truth. The district office will investigate, he finally said. James whistled softly. You're gutsy. But you know Thompson's not an easy guy to take down, right? I know, Ryan said quietly. But I won't give up. James nodded, a half-smile tugging at his lips. Good luck then. You're gonna need it. The next morning, as Ryan walked into school, he had a sinking feeling. Something was off, lingering in the air, making his skin prickle. He walked down the hallway, sensing the eyes on him. Whispers echoed behind him, as if everyone already knew something. Anxiety twisted in his gut. When he reached his locker, his worst fears were confirmed. The door swung open and Ryan froze. Inside, all of his belongings were covered in red paint. A piece of paper was taped to the door, the scrawled words dripping with malice, "Don't cause any more trouble." Ryan felt the air around him thicken. His hands clenched into fists, trembling despite his resolve. The hallway slowly quieted as more students took notice of the scene. Whispers spread like wildfire. Well, James's voice suddenly cut through the tension, and Ryan turned to find him standing next to him, as if he'd appeared out of nowhere. That's pretty harsh. Ryan swallowed, his face burning with a mix of anger and humiliation. Who did this? Oh, I wonder who, James shrugged, his expression unreadable. He smirked, nodding toward the teacher's lounge. You going to report this? Ryan tightened his fists. Of course. James shrugged again. Go ahead, but Thompson's not going to let it slide. Ryan ignored him, striding toward the principal's office. Anger drowned out the fear creeping in. When he stepped into the office, Principal Carter looked up from her stack of papers, surprised by his appearance. Ryan, what's going on? He placed the paper on her desk, keeping his voice steady even as his throat tightened. Someone vandalized my locker. Principal Carter read the note, her eyes widening. I understand, she said, her voice serious. Do you have any suspects? Ryan hesitated. He didn't have concrete proof, but the timing was too suspicious, especially after Thompson's threat. I think it was Mr. Thompson. Principal Carter's expression shifted, a mix of surprise and doubt crossing her face. This is a serious accusation, Ryan. I know, he replied firmly. But he's been targeting me for weeks now. This can't be a coincidence. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes thoughtful. I will investigate this. In the meantime, I'll have the staff clean up your locker. Thank you for reporting this, Ryan. He nodded and left the office, but the unease still weighed heavily on him. He knew the principal wanted to help, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't fully convinced of his side of the story. Later that afternoon, as he made his way home, Ryan's phone buzzed with a new email. He opened it, and his stomach twisted in knots. Title, Final warning, Ryan, you'd better stop now. You're digging your own grave. Consider this your final warning. There was no signature, but Ryan didn't need one to know who had sent it. His hand trembled as he reread the message. The anger bubbled up in his chest. Mr. Thompson was trying to intimidate him, but Ryan wasn't going to back down. He immediately forwarded the email to Principal Carter, adding a brief line. "This is what I'm up against. Please take this seriously." The next morning, when Ryan arrived at school, Principal Carter was waiting right outside his first classroom. Her serious expression made his heart sink. "Ryan, can we talk for a moment?" He nodded and followed her to a quiet corner of the hallway. "This is about the email, isn't it?" she asked. She nodded. "I've sent it to the district office, and they're taking it very seriously. However," she hesitated, her face full of concern. "Mr. Thompson is denying any involvement. He says the email is a forgery." Ryan's jaw clenched. "He's lying." "I believe you," Principal Carter said softly. "But without clear evidence, your word is still just an accusation. So, you need to be careful. Don't confront him directly, and if anything strange happens, report it immediately." Ryan nodded, but disappointment still churned within him. He hated the feeling of powerlessness. But he knew he couldn't give up. At lunch, the atmosphere in the school was tense. The rumors about the locker sabotage and threatening emails had spread, and everyone was talking about it. Ryan sat alone in the library, trying to focus on his homework when James appeared. "Well, you're really a magnet for trouble, huh?" James pulled a chair and sat across from him. "Do you really think Thompson is behind this?" "I don't think it anymore," Ryan muttered. "I know." James whistled. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But aren't you worried you're poking the bear?" Ryan shook his head. "He started it. I'm just standing up for myself." "Well, be careful." James shrugged. "Thompson's not the type to play fair." Ryan nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He needed to find a way to prove that Mr. Thompson was behind all of it. But how? That evening, Ryan sat at his desk, replaying the recordings of his past conversations with Mr. Thompson. He listened intently, hoping to catch any clue he might have missed. Suddenly, an idea struck him. He grabbed his phone and started searching for information about recording devices. If he could capture a direct threat from Mr. Thompson, he would have irrefutable proof. Ryan stared at the computer screen, where a picture of a small, sleek voice recorder appeared. His finger hovered over the "Buy Now" button. He knew it was risky, but it might be his only chance to expose Thompson once and for all. Taking a deep breath, Ryan clicked the button, officially beginning his plan. 2 days later, the package arrived. Ryan tore it open in his room, revealing the sleek recorder nestled inside. He turned it over in his hands, amazed by how ordinary it looked. Just a simple black pen, but inside, it held something that could change everything. Ryan spent the entire evening learning how to use it, testing the sound quality, and practicing turning it on and off discreetly. Once he was confident, he felt ready. Now, he just had to wait for the right moment. The next day, Ryan slipped the recorder into his jacket pocket before entering math class. Mr. Thompson greeted the class with his usual indifferent tone, but Ryan noticed the underlying tension in his demeanor. Throughout the lesson, Mr. Thompson was more cautious than usual, sticking closely to the material and completely avoiding eye contact with Ryan. That only made him more suspicious. When the bell signaling the end of the class rang, Ryan felt disappointed. He couldn't record any evidence if Mr. Thompson didn't make a mistake. But then, "Ryan, stay a moment," Mr. Thompson's voice called out. Ryan's heart skipped a beat, but he nodded, maintaining his composure. As the last of the students filed out, Mr. Thompson stepped up to his desk, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Do you know why I kept you after class?" he asked. Ryan silently activated the recorder in his pocket. "No, sir," he replied, keeping his voice steady. Mr. Thompson's lips twitched, almost forming a mocking smile. "I've been informed about your accusations, the emails, the vandalized locker." His voice lowered, cold. "You've got quite the imagination." Ryan clenched his hands under the desk but stayed silent. "Let me make it clear," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice sharpening. "You're walking a very fine line. If you continue, you'll find yourself in a situation you can't escape from. Ryan's heart pounded. Are you threatening me? Mr. Thompson chuckled, low and humorless. Of course not. I'm just giving you some advice. Focus on your studies and don't stir up trouble. For your own good. Ryan clenched his jaw. I just want to be treated fairly. And I just want to teach in peace, Mr. Thompson cut in, his voice sharper. But look at where we are. He stood up, brushing off his coat as if to erase the conversation. This conversation is over. Go back to class. Ryan stood, his legs trembling slightly as he left the room. But he couldn't shake the feeling of a small victory swelling in his chest. The pen had recorded it all. That night, Ryan turned on his computer, connected the recorder, and played back the audio. Everything was clear, Mr. Thompson's cold voice, each word dripping with veiled threats. Ryan clenched his fist, a mix of relief and resolve flooding through him. Finally, he had evidence. But as he sat there, a thought lingered in his mind. Was this enough? Mr. Thompson hadn't directly admitted to vandalizing the locker or sending the threatening emails. His words, though warning-laden, were still carefully chosen. Ryan needed more, something undeniable, a piece of evidence that couldn't be ignored. The next morning, Ryan arrived early at school. He stood near the teacher's lounge, the recorder ready in his pocket. He knew he was taking a risk, but if luck was on his side, he might catch Mr. Thompson saying something when he didn't know anyone was listening. A while later, he saw Mr. Thompson walking into the room, a coffee cup in hand. Ryan quietly approached, standing near the half-closed door. Voices from inside filtered out, faint but still audible. This is being blown out of proportion. Mr. Thompson's voice came through, filled with anger. Those kids are just trying to ruin my reputation. A softer voice responded, You've been under a lot of scrutiny lately. So what? Mr. Thompson snapped. If I let this slide, every student will think they can walk all over me. But what if the school district finds something? The other voice, more concerned, asked. That could backfire, it added. Mr. Thompson smirked, his voice dripping with bitterness. They won't find anything. I've made sure of that. Ryan's heart raced as he heard those words, his breath catching, trying not to make a sound. He leaned closer to hear better, but the door creaked under his movement. Both voices fell silent. Good morning, Mr. Thompson. A cold voice echoed. Ryan quickly ran down the hallway, his heart pounding in his ears. He didn't stop until he reached an empty classroom, hiding to catch his breath. He pulled the pin from his recorder, his hands shaking. If that conversation had been recorded, it could be the opportunity he needed. Later that afternoon, Ryan listened to the recording again. The quality wasn't as good as the first time, but Mr. Thompson's words were still clear. They won't find anything. I've made sure of that. Though the statement was vague, it still carried a sense of wrongdoing. Combined with the previous recording, it could be enough to force the school district to take action. Ryan transferred the files to his computer and composed a new email, attaching both recordings. He hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the send button. This was his chance to expose Mr. Thompson once and for all. After a deep breath, he clicked send. The next morning, Ryan was called into the principal's office again. This time, the atmosphere was different. Principal Carter looked both serious and worried, and seated across from her was a man Ryan had never seen before, dressed in a suit and holding a briefcase. Ryan, this is Mr. Daniels, Principal Carter said. He's from the school district's office. Ryan sat down, palms sweating. Mr. Daniels smiled politely. Ryan, we've reviewed the recordings you sent. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your interactions with Mr. Thompson. Ryan nodded, his heart racing as he recounted everything. The unfair grading, the threats, the vandalism, and the emails. He answered Mr. Daniels' questions as clearly as possible, feeling both relieved and tense. By the end of the meeting, he felt like he had done everything he could. As he walked out of the room, Ryan saw Mr. Thompson being escorted by another school district official. They locked eyes for a brief moment, and Ryan recognized the unmistakable fury in his gaze. Mr. Thompson leaned in close to the official, whispering something. Ryan didn't hear it, but the look Mr. Thompson shot him when he turned back made it clear. This wasn't over. Ryan sat at his desk, trying to focus on his homework, but his mind kept spinning. The furious look on Mr. Thompson's face as he was escorted out echoed in his thoughts, like a warning. The school district was involved now, and the recordings had made an impact, but Ryan knew the battle wasn't over. He didn't believe Mr. Thompson would accept defeat so easily. The next day, the atmosphere at school felt strange. Students whispered in the hallways, many glancing at him curiously. Word of Mr. Thompson's removal had spread quickly, although the details remained unclear. Some said he was fired, while others claimed he was just under investigation. Ryan didn't know the truth, and part of him didn't want to. When he reached his locker, he hesitated, half expecting a nasty note or some kind of vandalism. But his locker was untouched, everything inside undisturbed. It felt like a small victory, though the tension still lingered in the air. "Hey, Einstein," James's voice suddenly broke through his thoughts. Ryan leaned against his locker, James's familiar smile plastered on his face. "So, you really got rid of Thompson, huh?" Ryan shrugged. "Not yet. The school district is still investigating." James nodded, crossing his arms. "But you've made a statement. People are talking about you. Good job." Ryan's voice was firm as he replied, "Maybe now they'll think twice before letting someone like him get away with it again." James raised an eyebrow, his tone cautious. "Be careful, buddy. Pride before the fall, or something like that? Thompson's not the type to back down easily." Ryan sighed. "I know." By lunchtime, Ryan's anxiety had only grown. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was simmering beneath the surface, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Sitting alone in the library, scrolling through his phone, he received a new email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line made his blood run cold. "You think you've won?" Ryan opened the email, his hand trembling. The message was short but chilling. "You're just a kid. You don't know who you're messing with. This isn't over." No name, but Ryan didn't need one. He knew exactly who it was. Mr. Thompson. His heart raced as he stared at the screen. How could this be? That teacher should be under investigation. How was he still able to contact him? Ryan immediately forwarded the email to Principal Carter and the district office, along with a brief note explaining that he believed it was from Mr. Thompson. He hit send, then sat back, trying to calm the anxiety in his chest. That afternoon, Ryan was called to the principal's office again. As he walked in, Principal Carter and Mr. Daniels were waiting for him, both looking serious, their faces tense. "Hello, Ryan," Principal Carter said, gesturing for him. "We've received your email, thank you for reporting it. Were you able to trace the origin of the email?" Ryan's voice remained steady, though fear crept into his chest. "We're working with IT," Mr. Daniels replied. "The email was sent from a private account, but we've forwarded it to the IT department for further investigation. If it's connected to Mr. Thompson, it will strengthen the case against him." Ryan nodded, but his stomach twisted. What if it's not him? Mr. Daniels's expression softened slightly. "If it's not, we'll look into other leads. Either way, you did the right thing by reporting it." Principal Carter looked at him seriously, her gaze unwavering. "Ryan, I know this is difficult, but I want you to know that we're taking this very seriously. If you ever feel unsafe or notice anything unusual, report it to us immediately." Ryan nodded again, but as he left the office, an unsettling dread filled him. That email felt like a direct threat, and it only confirmed what he already knew: Mr. Thompson would not stay silent. That night, Ryan sat at his computer, scrolling through articles about teacher misconduct. Many of the cases had already been resolved, but others had dragged on for years, with students subjected to mistreatment. The thought made him uneasy. He didn't want to spend the rest of his high school years as the kid who had caused a teacher to be fired. A sudden noise made Ryan jump. A light tap against the window. He froze, his heart pounding. Slowly, he turned his head toward the window. It was dark outside, but he could vaguely make out a shadow moving near the bushes. Ryan held his breath, quickly grabbing his phone and sneaking toward the window. His hand shook as he pulled the curtain aside. The shadow shifted, and for a moment he thought he saw a face, but before he could get a better look, the figure vanished into the night. Ryan quickly dialed 911, his voice trembling as he explained the situation. Within minutes, the sound of sirens echoed, and 2 police officers arrived, scouring the area, but found nothing. "Are you sure you saw someone?" one of the officers asked. Ryan nodded, his voice still shaky. "I think so. There was someone, but I'm certain someone was out there." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before responding. "We'll patrol around here for a while. If you see or hear anything, call us immediately." Ryan thanked them, watching as they left, the police car disappearing into the darkness. He locked all the windows, his heart still racing. He couldn't be sure if the shadowy figure outside was connected to Mr. Thompson, but the timing of it all was too suspicious to ignore. The next morning, Ryan went to school feeling exhausted but determined. He wouldn't let fear take control. As he entered his math class, the substitute teacher greeted him with a warm smile. "Good morning, Ryan," she said. "I heard you've been through quite a lot lately. If there's anything I can do to help, just let me know." Ryan nodded, appreciating her kindness, though unsure how to respond. He opened his notebook, trying to focus on the lesson, but as the teacher wrote on the board, Ryan caught something out of the corner of his eye. A piece of paper was tucked under his textbook, neatly folded. His heart raced as he reached for it. Opening the paper, he read the familiar scrawl, "You're being watched." Ryan gripped the paper tightly, his mind spinning as he glanced around. The teacher continued to lecture, oblivious to the rising tension on Ryan's desk. Whoever was behind this hadn't stopped, and Ryan knew their next move would be even more dangerous. He sat frozen, his eyes still locked on the note in his hand. "You're being watched." Those words felt like cold hands tightening around his chest. He scanned the room, wondering if anyone was watching him, but his classmates were all focused on the lesson. If someone had left the note, they had done so with unsettling precision. The substitute teacher noticed Ryan's distracted expression. "Ryan, are you okay?" Ryan quickly folded the note and shoved it into his pocket. "I'm fine," he stammered, though his trembling hands betrayed him. During lunch, Ryan found a quiet corner in the library to think. He pulled out the note and studied every word. His mind spun, the handwriting identical to the previous threats. Though he had no concrete proof, he was certain Mr. Thompson was behind it all. But how could that be? The teacher should be under investigation. Was someone helping him, or was Thompson acting through another person? Ryan realized he couldn't solve this on his own. He took a picture of the note and sent it to Principal Carter, along with a brief message. "Another threat found in class today. Please help." At the end of the day, Ryan was called into the principal's office. This time, Mr. Daniels and a security officer were waiting, along with Principal Carter. "Ryan, thank you for reporting this," Principal Carter said, his voice serious. "We're investigating the emails and this note, and we believe we're close to tracing its origin." Ryan's heart raced faster. "Is it Mr. Thompson?" Mr. Daniels sighed. "This is complicated. The email account used to send the threats was set up under a fake name, but we've traced the IP address to an internet cafe near his house. While it's not concrete evidence, it's highly suspicious." The security officer leaned forward. "We've also increased surveillance around the school. If anyone tries to approach you or your belongings, we'll catch them." Ryan nodded, grateful for their support, though an uneasy feeling lingered. "What about the notes? How did they get into my stuff?" Principal Carter furrowed his brow. "That's what we're trying to figure out. For now, keep a close eye on your belongings and report anything unusual immediately." The following days passed without incident, but the tension never dissipated. Ryan felt as though he was constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next threat. He kept his voice recorder with him at all times, determined to document anything suspicious. Then one evening the breakthrough came. Ryan's phone buzzed with a notification from the district office. An email containing an attached video and a brief message. "We think you should watch this." Ryan opened the video, his hands trembling. It was a security footage clip from the school, showing the hallway outside his classroom. He fast-forwarded through the first few minutes, watching the students coming and going, until the second minute arrived. his breath caught in his throat. There, on the screen, was Mr. Thompson. Though he had been barred from teaching, somehow, he had managed to approach the building. He glanced around cautiously, then sneaked into Ryan's classroom. Less than a minute later, he exited empty-handed, but his stiff, hurried gait made it clear. This was when he had placed the threatening note. The next morning, Ryan arrived at school, a palpable tension hanging in the air. Teachers whispered in the hallways, and students seemed unusually fidgety. It didn't take long for Ryan to understand why. During the first class, Principal Carter made an announcement over the PA system. Attention students and staff, we would like to inform you that, effective immediately, Mr. Thompson is no longer employed at Jefferson High School. For any questions or concerns, please contact the principal's office. Thank you. The classroom erupted into whispers, but Ryan sat frozen, still in disbelief. It was over. Mr. Thompson had been caught. After school, Principal Carter called Ryan into her office once more. She greeted him with a warm smile as he entered and gestured toward the seat. Ryan, I want to thank you for your courage. Standing up to someone in a position of power isn't easy, but because of you, we were able to take action. Ryan nodded, a mix of relief and exhaustion settling in his chest. So, he's gone? Ryan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Principal Carter replied. The Department of Education terminated his contract, and he is now banned from the school grounds. The police are also investigating the threats. Ryan exhaled a shaky breath. I just wanted it to stop. And you did, Principal Carter said, her tone firm. You've shown extraordinary strength throughout all of this. I hope you know how proud we are of you. That evening, Ryan walked home, a sense of relief washing over him that he hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time in a long time, he felt safe, as though he could finally begin living in peace again. When he got home, he opened his notebook and started sketching out a new math problem, immersing himself in the calm of the numbers. As he worked, a thought crossed his mind. Standing up for himself was terrifying, but also so incredibly worth it. He had proven that even the smallest voices can be powerful when they speak the truth. Ryan smiled to himself as his pen moved confidently across the page. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but one thing was for certain, he was ready to face them. Ryan had won the battle. But deep down he knew the war was far from over. Mr. Thompson was gone. The truth had been exposed. The school would never look at Ryan the same way again. Some admired him. Some resented him. But one thing was certain, he would never be invisible again. Yet, as he walked through the now familiar halls, he couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered in the air. The whispers hadn't disappeared. The system hadn't changed overnight. Because the world didn't like it when people like Ryan fought back. And Ryan wasn't the only one. How many other students had been silenced? How many had their futures stolen, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they were never given a chance? How many had walked into classrooms, knowing that no matter how hard they worked, someone would always try to tear them down? This wasn't just Ryan's story. It was a story of every child who had ever been told, you don't belong here. But here's the thing about people like Ryan. They don't stop. They don't break. They don't wait for permission to succeed. And that's exactly why the world fears them. So if you think this story ends here, think again. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared with the intention of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any mistakes, kindly overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.